Hey, what's up, guys? This is the third episode in my Linguistics 101 video series, and today we're going to be talking about phonology, which, if you didn't know any better, you would be excused for thinking that this sounds exactly like phonetics. But these two fields of study are actually very different in some important ways, and we're going to talk about that in this video. Now, phonology is something that I think is really important to learn if you want to learn good pronunciation in your target language. And interestingly, this is something that's almost never taught in language classes. So out of all the Spanish classes that I've taken in my life, I only ever had one class that even touched on phonology, and that was an upper level linguistics Spanish class. So this is something that they don't teach in school, but I think it has a huge potential to help you improve your accent in the language that you're learning. So what is phonology? Phonology is the study of the systematic organization of sounds within a given language. And I know that sounds probably a little bit intimidating, but we're going to explain this as we go along. Sometimes this systematic organization is just called the grammar of sounds. It's a logic-based organization through which the sounds in a certain language can be organized. And when I say a certain language, I'm not talking about any language in particular. It could be any one of the 6,000 languages on Earth. All right. So last week we talked about phonetics. This video is on phonology. So what's the difference? Again, if you didn't watch the video yet from last week, I'll link to it here. Or here, I never know where that link is going to come up. This is probably going to be something that's very useful for you to understand phonology. So I would go back and watch that video before continuing on. Phonetics is the study of sounds the study of sounds in and of themselves. Okay, so a phoneticist is only interested in studying sound, and you don't need to make any reference to a given language, to any language. You could just study sound waves by themselves that a human has produced, or a phoneticist could study. They could find a parrot in the wild, if it was making human speech sounds, then they could study those sound waves. Okay, regardless of whether it was connected to a language or not. Phonology cannot be studied that way. Phonology is a study of the logical organization of sounds within a specific language. So this requires a reference to a specific language. Doesn't matter which language it is, but in order to study phonology, you need a language. Spanish, German, Russian, Chinese. You cannot study sounds in phonology separated from a language. You can do that in phonetics, but not in phonology. So, like I said, an understanding of basic phonetics is going to be helpful. If you haven't watched the video from last week, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, I'm going to link, I'll try to link up here to a Wikipedia page that can help you understand about the IPA and the International Phonetic Alphabet. I'm going to be making references to that in this video. So you might be able to follow along without having seen that, but it'll probably be much more difficult. All right. The basic unit of phonology is the phoneme. So what is that? A phoneme is a basic unit of sound that is able to distinguish one word from another in a given language. And there's two parts that I want to highlight there. The first of which is the fact that a phoneme has to be able to distinguish one word from another. And that's important because there are sounds in language that cannot be used to distinguish one word from another. So in order to be a phoneme, it has to be able to contrast meaning. And it has to be in a given language. We already talked about how that's important. You can't study phonology without studying a certain language. And I also need to point out that a phoneme is different from a letter. Now, in literate society, we've connected these two so closely in our minds that sometimes it's hard to separate it. A letter is a unit of writing. Okay, a phoneme is a unit of speech, and they don't always agree with one another. They certainly don't translate well together. Linguists study spoken language or sign language, but they do not study writing because that's not real. Writing is not an essential part of what language is. So if you're really trying to study the fundamentals of language, you're studying spoken or signed language. All right, now when we're trying to determine what is a phoneme in a language, a useful trick is to look for what we call minimal pairs. A minimal pair is two words that differ in only one sound. So you have the words would and good, which differ only in the first sound. You have the words see and saw, which differ only in the last sound. Same with will and with, they differ only in the last sound, and lawn and long. Now, I want to point this out because in my previous video I mentioned that you might not be aware that the sound at the end of the word long is a single sound. Because we spell it with a G, like I said, writing always messes with your perceptions of sounds. We spell it with a G in English, but when you pronounce it, you don't say long. That's not two separate sounds there. That's its own sound. And in the IPA, we spell it with this. It looks like an N with kind of a G tail. So you know the people that came up with the IPA were real creative. But so the point is that we're able to contrast these two words by using two different phonemes. Lawn and long. We also need to make the difference between a speech sound and a phoneme. A speech sound is not bound to any given language. It's just a sound wave that is produced in the mouth. So like I said, a parrot in the wild could produce a speech sound, even though they don't speak any given language. A phoneme is abstract, okay? So a phoneme is actually an abstract collection of speech sounds. We're going to explain that a little bit more, so don't worry if it doesn't make sense yet. But essentially, a phoneme can manifest itself in different ways depending on its environment. So it will surface as different speech sounds. And this is probably not something that you have maybe noticed in real life, but I promise once I point it out, you're going to start seeing this all the time, especially if you start studying this a little bit more regularly. You're going to realize that one phoneme is not pronounced in any single way. It's pronounced in a variety of different ways depending on the phonological environment that it's found in. So an easy way of explaining this is that phonemes are like werewolves, and I'm going to admit right up front that I am shamelessly stealing this from a linguist named David Peterson in his book, The Art of Language Invention. It's a great book. I bought the ebook and I read it on my Kindle, and I liked it so much that I bought the paper copy just because. He also has a great YouTube channel, so I would recommend checking that out. So I'm stealing this from him, and in his book, in the chapter about allophony, he tells you to imagine a guy named Tony, and this is a picture of Tony down here below me, and we don't know what Tony looks like at first. But we don't need to know what Tony looks like because at first we're just imagining an abstract representation of him, which is this pseudo picture of Tony below me. Now we learn that Tony looks different in different environments, so he changes depending on his environment. In the environment of a full moon, Tony looks like a wolf. In all other environments, Tony looks like a human. Now, it's important to remember that regardless of the form that he takes, regardless of what he looks like, Tony is always still Tony. And we're going to call this abstract Tony. So we could say that abstract Tony is a collection of the various physical manifestations of Tony. You have wolf Tony, you have human Tony, but they're always still Tony. And another thing that's important to notice here is that you can always predict what Tony will look like based off of his environment. So you don't actually need to see Tony in order to know what he looks like. You could just know that abstract Tony is existing under the environment of a full moon, and then you know for sure that Tony is in his wolf form. And if you know that abstract Tony is currently in the environment of a sunny day, then you know that Tony is, you have a for sure knowledge that Tony is currently in his human form. So that's what I mean by this is predictable. You can always predict what Tony will look like in a given moment based off of his environment. So we're going to do an example here. We're going to do a short experiment. We're going to make up an imaginary phoneme. Now remember that a phoneme is an abstract collection of speech sounds, much in the same way that abstract Tony is kind of an abstract collection of the two different physical forms that Tony can take. So our made-up phoneme, we're going to call this phoneme smile, or smiley phoneme. I don't know. Well, it's going to be represented by a smiley face. Now, like all phonemes, this phoneme changes based off its environment, just like Tony. And we're going to take a look at the environments below me. All right, the first environment that this phoneme can be found in is between two vowels. And when it occurs between two vowels, it's going to sound like, we would call this sound a tap. And that's the same sound that is found in Spanish words that have an R. So, for example, like the Spanish word para. That's the sound that this phoneme is going to take. Before a y sound, this phoneme is going to turn into an affricate, like ch in chair. When it takes place at the end of the word, it will turn into the sound that we call a glottal stop. And the IPA symbol for this sound, it kind of looks like a question mark, but we call it a glottal stop. And we don't actually have this as a phoneme in English, but it does occur in speech in words like, if you were to say uh-oh, then that sudden stop of air in between the vowels is your glottal stop. So what you're actually, it's called the glottal stop because what you're doing is you're completely cutting off the airflow at your glottis. So that's the sound that this is going to turn into when it's at the end of a word. At the beginning of a word, this is going to turn into an aspirated t sound. And aspiration means you have a little puff of air coming out, and that's why this IPA symbol is drawn with a little H over it. Then in all other environments, or in other words, you could say elsewhere, this sound is going to be pronounced as a D, just like in the word step. And this is different from the aspirated sound that we just talked about. This is actually very similar to the way that all T sounds are pronounced in Spanish. So in the word, I don't know, toro, you're going to pronounce that a little bit different than if you had an English accent saying toro. So these are the different environments that phoneme smiley can occur in, and all the different ways that this phoneme can manifest itself. All right, now we're going to put this to the test. Pop quiz. So, look, my question to you is look at the following phonological environments. And by environments, I just mean what sounds are surrounding the phoneme. Look at the following phonological environments, and we're going to determine which word or which precise speech sound this phoneme is going to manifest itself as. So the first one we have wa, and then we have our smiley phoneme, and then we have which is a vowel, if you watched the phonetics video from last week. So, since this phoneme smiley takes place between the vowel ah and the vowel we look at our environment chart over here, and we see that when it takes place between two vowels, it turns into the flap, or the r sound in the Spanish word para. We'll go down and look to our next environment, where we have s, and then we have our smiley phoneme, and then u. So what's this going to look like in this environment? Well, we're going to look at our environment chart below me. I'm actually looking at this environment chart over here on my laptop, but you guys look at the one below me. So does it take place between two vowels? Well, no, because it's preceded by a s sound. Does it take place before a y? No, it takes place before an u sound. Does it take place at the end of the word? No, it takes place before an u. Does it take place at the beginning of the word? No, it's not that. So the only environment we're left with is the catch-all, all other environments, or the elsewhere environment. And you're going to notice that there's almost always an environment like this when we're describing phonemes. So we would have to conclude that this word, this phoneme, in this exact instance, is pronounced d, the same way, almost the same way that a T is pronounced in Spanish. So I'm going to give you a moment to go through all of these environments down in the corner. Practice this by yourself. Pause this, and then if you've paused it and you have figured out all the different manifestations of this phoneme, then I'm going to move on to the next slide. And what we're going to see is that this is actually a real phoneme in the English language. And so let's talk about that. This is a phoneme in American English. British English, Australian English are a little bit different. So, in the word water, a lot of you would say we have a T sound. You know, I don't like using that word T because that's a letter. But this phoneme in the word water, when it takes place between two vowels in American English, it turns into a flap. That's why you don't say water unless you're from Britain or somewhere. In America, we say water, and it sounds kind of like a D. It's not actually a D sound. It's this flap, and in between two vowels, it's just like Tony. It becomes converted not into a werewolf, but into a flap. In the environment where it follows an S and precedes a U, this T sound stays just the way it normally would. When it precedes a Y sound, it turns into kind of a CH, which is why we don't say I bet ya or I bet you, we say I betcha. When it comes at the end of a word, a lot of times this sound is not pronounced. So when we're actually speaking in real, actual fluent speech, we normally wouldn't pronounce the word not. We would say it's not. I'm not happy, right? We don't say I'm not happy unless you're a robot. And then when this word takes place when the sound takes place at the beginning of a word, we find that it's aspirated. So in the word 10, there's a puff of air coming out of your mouth at the beginning of that word. And an interesting thing to notice is that you can actually usually deconstruct the underlying form of this environment. So given the word water, you know somewhere deep in your mind that it would actually be pronounced as water. And that's because you know that the phoneme itself is pronounced as d. You know, in the word betcha, you know, underlyingly, this is actually bet you. So you can deconstruct these all these manifestations of the phoneme into the phoneme itself. I want to give a little bit of proof about some of these claims, because you may not immediately be able to tell the difference between some of those different manifestations of the phonemes, and I want to prove them to you. So you can test this claim by holding your hand in front of your mouth and saying the words to and the words stew. This is assuming you're a native speaker of English. If you're a non-native speaker, you might still be able to test this theory. It might not work for you, so you're just going to have to trust me then. When you say to, because it's at the beginning of a word, you're going to feel that puff of air, that aspiration, or the little H that we would draw over the symbol in the IPA. So that's a to sound. When you say the word stew, and this sound is suddenly not at the beginning of a word, you're not going to have that aspiration. So stew, 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 stew. It's not stew. You could say it that way, but that's just not the way it's pronounced in English because it's not at the beginning of the word. When you say stew, you don't feel that puff of air. So you could also do this with a piece of paper. And if you don't speak English and you're having trouble with this experiment, hopefully this will prove it to you. Put a piece of paper in front of your mouth and say the word to. You see how much motion there is? To. It's because there's a puff of air coming out. Then you say words like stew, no movement at all. Stew, stew, stew. To, to. And the reason is because that phoneme, that manifestation of that phoneme is now not taking place at the beginning of the word. And this is an interesting point to make, going off of what I talked about earlier in the video. Remember I said that a phoneme has to be able to contrast between different meanings of a word. So I'm going to take this up again. Now let's say I say the word stew and then I say the word stew. Okay? Two different ways of pronouncing those words. That same word. That is technically two different speech sounds, but they're not separate phonemes because they cannot be used to contrast the word. So stew is the same word as stew. It's just a different way of pronouncing the same word because it's really just one phoneme. Put another way, t and d are not separate phonemes. They're both the same phoneme. They're different speech sounds located within the same phoneme. If it doesn't make sense yet, I'm going to try to explain that in a little bit more detail as the video goes on. And of course, if at any time in this video you have questions for me or I didn't explain something very well, please feel free to leave me comments below. I love talking linguistics. I love helping other people learn, and it really flatters me when you guys leave me linguistics questions. So please feel free to do that. So hopefully that has proved to you that that all of these different forms of the t phoneme actually exist. Now what are we going to name this phoneme? Because of course we can't just use smiley. That's not very scientific. There's usually, like I said earlier, there's almost always one environment that is broader than the other environments. I should say there's one specific manifestation of the phoneme, one speech sound that is found in a broader environment than all the other phonemes. For that environment, we call it the elsewhere case. The phoneme itself, the whole main overarching phoneme, is usually named after the elsewhere case, which is one of the speech sounds in the bucket of speech sounds that are encompassed in that one phoneme. And we call that the elsewhere case, and we write it between slashes. In the previous example, the speech sound d was found in all other environments, in other words, elsewhere. So since that sound has the broadest environment, the phoneme itself that we were calling smiley can actually be called a voiceless alveolar stop. And I'm trying to avoid using the word T. I will admit that linguists are human as well. A lot of times when we're being lazy, we will just refer to this as T. I'm trying not to do this in this video because I don't want to confuse you. It's not a T, it's a voiceless alveolar stop. You could call it just the T sound if that's easier. Let's do a case study on Spanish voiced stops because I want these linguistics videos to be relevant to people who are learning foreign languages. And this is what you're going to have to do depending on the language that you're learning. If you're learning Spanish, then this is great. I'm giving you a golden nugget, a tidbit for your pronunciation in Spanish. If you're learning some other language, German, Arabic, then you're going to have to go look up some phonemes and allophones in the language that you're doing, that you're learning. And Wikipedia is a great resource for that, I find, if you have the basic underlying knowledge of phonology. So, in Spanish, the voiced stops b, d, and g turn into their corresponding fricatives v, the, and gr when they come after a vowel. We talked about stops and fricatives in my previous phonetics video, so again, if you haven't watched that, be sure to watch it in order to get the basic understanding of what these two types of sounds are. So, what we would say is that that the phoneme b has two forms. It has the speech sound b and the speech sound v. So the word lobo in Spanish, because this voiced bilabial stop is located between two vowels, it's not actually pronounced lobo in Spanish. It's pronounced lobo, and that stop turns into a fricative. The word verdad, it's kind of hard to pronounce that like the wrong way. Verdad, it's not pronounced verdad, it's pronounced verdad, because that last D sound, that last voiced alveolar stop, is preceded by a vowel. The other D sound is not preceded by a vowel, and the B at the beginning is not preceded by a vowel. So the only one that changes is the one at the very end. Similarly, we have the word gata, which means cat, and this starts with a stop. It starts with a voiced stop. And what we see is that when we add another word at the beginning of it, the definite article la, to turn this into the cat, we'll see that this word, this sound actually turns into a fricative. So instead of gata, it's la gata. And I don't know if you can tell the difference between there. I'm not a native Spanish speaker, so I might not be doing this perfectly. So let's talk about phonemes and allophones for a little bit. An allophone is one of the specific speech sounds that is encompassed within the overarching phoneme. Okay, so in the case of the English example, we have d, r, ch, the glottal stop, and the aspirated t. Those are all allophones because they're the specific manifestations of the broader phoneme. In the Spanish example, we have the phonemes b and v, which are they're allophones of the phoneme b. D and th are allophones of the phoneme d, and g and g are allophones of the phoneme g. I want to point out that the word allophone can only be used in reference to some phoneme, okay? So T is not just an allophone by itself. It's an allophone of the phoneme D. I also want to point out that these relationships between allophone and phoneme, they only exist within the context of a given language. Goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning of the video. V is not an allophone in English. It's only an allophone of the Spanish word, the Spanish phoneme B, and other languages as well, but it doesn't exist in English. The tap that is used as a allophone of the English phoneme T, this sound is an allophone in English, but it is a phoneme in Spanish. It's a phoneme that's used in the word para, caro. That's just a phoneme by itself in Spanish, whereas in English, it doesn't have phoneme status. It's only an allophone of the D phoneme. So I hope that distinction is clear. So that's all I have for this video. If you have any comments, please don't be afraid to ask. Also be sure to look up the phonology of the language you're learning. Like I said, Wikipedia is a great resource for that. And we'll see you guys in my next video.